So our speaker today is a very prominent Shakespearean scholar. He is from the University of Virginia, where he is the Clifton Waller Barrett Professor in the English department. I guess that's how the title goes, at the University of Virginia. He received his PhD from Harvard University back in 1971. And he's written a lot of plays, and not only about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's times, but he is also a very prominent authority on popular culture in all its aspects, not merely its connection to the literary greats, but popular culture as a serious set of art forms. Among the books he's written, for example, in the vein of popular culture, is, I like this title, Gilligan Unbound, Pop Culture in the Age of Globalization. He is an authority, we'll see if he says much about it, on Austrian economics. I don't know how many of you know about Austrian economics, and I don't know how many of you will know more about Austrian economics after you heard Professor Cantor, but he's written on that, Literature and the Economics of Liberty, Spontaneous Order and Culture, that came out in 2010. Back in 1974, he wrote Shakespeare's Roman plays, 1989, a book on Hamlet, and most recently, and I just had the pleasure of reading it, and we'll do an interview about it tomorrow, which you can see later on our website, Shakespeare's Roman Trilogy. And that's only a small amount of what Paul has done. So you're in for a treat, and let's get rid of me and get on with it. So.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm very proud and honored to be here at Texas Tech. I'm going to try to give you the big picture on Shakespeare today and relate him to this theme of Western civilization. I believe that Shakespeare is one of the pinnacles of Western civilization, maybe the pinnacle in terms of cultural achievement. Why restrict it to Western civilization? I think Shakespeare represents the pinnacle of the cultural achievement of humanity. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that he's the pinnacle of cultural achievement of the entire solar system. Maybe even of the Milky Way galaxy. I don't know about Andromeda, but the sky is big. And I think one of the reasons is that he has such a grasp of what we call Western civilization. That, as I'll try to show you today, he understands the roots of our civilization in ancient Rome, but he also sees how much the development of Christian culture in the Middle Ages contributed, and finds many ways in which the classical and Christian traditions work together, but also many ways in which they are at odds and in tension, and that produces some of the greatest tragedies in Shakespeare's plays. And I'm going to stress the incredible historical and geographical range of his work, that his plays range all over the Europe of his day, and they also go way back in time, not just in English history, but all the way back to ancient Rome as well. And I think he honestly is capable of understanding different nations and different time periods. Now, in a way that may seem obvious, it's one of the reasons his plays strike us as timeless, but in fact, there's a lot of scholars who deny this about Shakespeare, who see him as an Elizabethan Englishman who view his horizons restricted rather narrowly to his time period. There are many critics, for example, who say that Shakespeare's Roman plays are not really about Rome. That is, Romans are just Elizabethan Englishmen with togas on, and that he's incapable of imagining himself into the ancient world. Now, I think that's wrong, and I think it's fundamentally wrong. There's in fact a kind of irony to this, that Shakespeare towers above his contemporaries. That's why we read him. We don't read his contemporaries anywhere near as much, and often do it only to get another angle on Shakespeare. We are interested in the Elizabethan period because somehow it produced Shakespeare. But many people try to reduce Shakespeare to the Elizabethan period, and that's what I'm going to try to counter here. I think of Shakespeare as obviously a great poet, a great dramatist, but also a great thinker, and worthy to stand among the great philosophers in human history. I have found over the years that what really helps me understand Shakespeare is going back very specifically to Plato and Aristotle, among his near contemporaries, reading Machiavelli. In my new book, Shakespeare's Roman Trilogy, I have an extended comparison between Shakespeare and Friedrich Nietzsche on ancient Rome. It may strike you as very odd, but I found it very helpful in understanding Shakespeare's view of Rome to see what another of the very greatest thinkers about Rome said. So I want to treat Shakespeare as someone who goes beyond his own age. And I'm going to, in many ways, focus on politics here, and use the issue of monarchy as my entrance into this. For whole generations, it was assumed that Shakespeare was somehow a monarchist. He lived under a monarchy, and people assume he must have believed that monarchy is the best form of government. And to know what Shakespeare thinks about monarchy, we were directed to read all these second and third-rate Elizabethan treatises on monarchy. Now, there's no evidence that Shakespeare ever went out in the street with placards saying, "Down with Elizabeth, to hell with monarchy." He would have been killed if he'd done that, which is an indication that maybe we can't obviously know what he thought about monarchy. And in recent years, people have begun to see that there may be ways in which Shakespeare found monarchy challenging. How could you not, looking at the kinds of people that ended up on the English throne? Fairly recently, a man named Andrew Hatfield wrote a book called Shakespeare and Republicanism, and that's with a small r, that challenged this assumption, and I had been challenging it since 1976, in my first book, Shakespeare's Roman Republic and Empire. But it's an interesting fact, and what I'm going to show you today is Shakespeare displayed a remarkable curiosity in republics, that he went back to ancient Rome to study the Roman Republic, and he even took a serious look at Venice in two of his most famous plays, Merchant of Venice and Othello, and I hope to get to them today as well. And it looks as if he was trying to figure out this, hey, what's this new thing called a republic, and how's it working out among the Italian cities? And some people find this so odd. England was a monarchy. No one was talking about republics. Fewer than 30 years after Shakespeare's death, England was a republic. Oliver Cromwell comes out of nowhere and establishes a commonwealth. Part of our problem is the Elizabethans didn't use the word republic. They used the word commonwealth, but it means the same thing. And where did that come from? Maybe somebody was thinking about republics as early as Shakespeare's day. And that's what I want to suggest here. So what I'm going to do, very easy task, I'm going to cover Shakespeare's history plays, then his Roman plays, and then Merchant of Venice and Othello. So maybe I'll cover about, 9 plays for you. I'll throw in something else if I have time. And what I'm doing in a way is ridiculous. But this is way too much to cover in one talk. But on the other hand, sometimes we do have to step back and see the big picture. Shakespeare's greatness is evident on the micro level, but it's also there on the macro level. So I could give you a 90-minute lecture on one line in one of Shakespeare's plays. That's why I make the big bucks. And obviously I could give you an interesting lecture on one of the plays. Sometimes, though, we have to step back and figure, how do these plays work together? I think Shakespeare's actually created a universe in these plays, the Shakespearean cosmos. And I'll say this, if one wanted to understand Western civilization, one could do stupider things than to spend one's life studying Shakespeare's plays. I think if one ever could understand how they all fit together, and by the way, I don't claim to do that, but if one could, I think it would give us a deep insight into Western civilization and what its components are and how they work together and how they work against each other. So let me begin with the history plays. And again, my aim here is to show Shakespeare had a sense of history. He knew that the human condition changes over time, and especially that it changes when politics changes, and that changes in regime change the whole ball game. They create new human possibilities and shut off old ones. And to me, this is why Shakespeare is so profound. So, his history plays are a substantial part of his achievement. Of his 37 or so plays, 10 of them are history plays. I'm going to concentrate on what we scholars call the second tetralogy, which is Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V. These, I'll say, are his most mature history plays, his best history plays. They work together as a tetralogy and reveal his understanding of politics in general and kingship in particular. And indeed, when you study them, you see how complicated the question of kingship is in Shakespeare's mind, that one cannot simply say he's for or against kingship because there's so many different kinds of kingship. And this set of 4 plays turns on the difference between, to use our term, medieval kingship. Shakespeare didn't have the word medieval, but medieval kingship and modern kingship. And that's the difference between a feudal monarchy and a modern centralized monarchy. Now, feudal is F-E-U-D-A-L, that kind of feudal. But if you heard it as futile, you got the point, because Shakespeare's point is feudal monarchy is futile monarchy. He saw it as deeply problematic and not succeeding in its own fundamental goal of providing a succession of effective kings. Now, the particular aspect of feudal monarchy that Shakespeare concentrates on is the division in sovereignty. This whole system of feudalism was essentially one where the king is first among equals. That's exaggerating it, but the point is that there are these great barons in the land. They have their own armies. They have people directly loyal to them. And effectively, they can counter the king's power. All these famous civil wars in Shakespeare, the Wars of the Roses, which he treated in his first tetralogy, the Henry VI plays and Richard III, or for that matter, the battles going on in the second tetralogy, they show that the king is, in the medieval model, is just not strong enough if the barons gang up on him. And that in itself is a problem. The other problem is the position of the church in the medieval world, where it is an independent power, independent of the king's sovereignty, and owns vast amounts of land and in effect can mount armies. on its own. Many of the difficult moments for Shakespeare's kings are when an archbishop or a bishop joins in a rebellion against the king, and that happens throughout Shakespeare's history plays. And again, it's another issue of divided sovereignty. What Shakespeare's history plays show is the emergence of some kind of centralized sovereignty under what we would think of a modern monarch. Shakespeare shows it ultimately happening with Henry VII in his play Richard III, and again, a model for this ultimately was Henry VIII. But already in the second tetralogy, it's second in order of composition, but deals with earlier events historically, he shows Henry V as a king who's finally unifying England. And that's very important for Shakespeare to bring some kind of stable sovereignty to the land. Now, this set of 4 plays begins with Richard II. And Richard II really begins in the medieval world, the high medieval world. The opening scene is almost straight out of King Arthur and his knights. We've got almost a tournament. We've got 2 knights in shining armor showing up ready for a ritual combat. And for Shakespeare, ritual combat is a sign of everything that's glorious and everything that's screwed up about the medieval world. Ritual combat is to settle a dispute, to settle an issue of justice. 2 knights fight to the death. And the one who's alive is the just one. Now, that's not the way to settle issues of justice. It presumes that God will only let the just one win. Historically, that doesn't appear to be the case. And indeed, what we see at the opening of the play is this wonderful world of chivalry. Knights are taking oaths. It's very ceremonial and ritual, and all the banners are flying. And there's a dispute over who killed somebody, and a noble named Bolingbroke is going to fight some guy named Mowbray. And it really is everything that feudal monarchy is. Everything political is saturated with religion. Now, at that point, Shakespeare has one of the great cuts, cinematic cuts, in all his plays as we go from scene 1 of Richard II to scene 2. Scene 1 is this beautiful public display of chivalry and nobility. Scene 2, we see Richard in private with his inner counselors, and they're just trying to figure out how to extract as much taxes as they can from the poor citizens of England to keep financing Richard's incredibly extravagant and luxurious court. And we reach a point later in the act where a guy named John of Gaunt dies, an important noble, Richard's uncle, and Richard just seizes his land. Violating every principle of right and really undermining his own claim to his throne, as many of his counselors try to advise him. So on the one hand, Shakespeare shows this medieval world is hypocritical. You got all these public pronouncements of religious faith and undergirding the regime by religion. It turns out just a cover for a corrupt court. And moreover, Richard II expresses faith in the divine right of kings. As with the very premise of ritual combat, he thinks, God's going to defend me. I'm the anointed king. I can deal with any rebels. What he lacks, however, is armies. And he thinks that his defense is somewhere up in heaven, but he's down on earth. And it turns out this guy Bolingbroke, who will become King Henry IV, is able to muster a greater army than Richard and defeat him and depose him. And again, Shakespeare recognizes how beautiful this kind of medieval monarchy looked, but it was fundamentally weak. Especially because of the divided sovereignty and this assumption that God would come to its aid, the aid of this regime, whereas Bolingbroke goes by the principle God helps those who help themselves. And in particular, one thing Shakespeare shows is a lingering fascination with the Crusades in medieval monarchy. Now, these events are taking place in the 1300s after the Fourth Crusade. But it's actually interesting. Shakespeare shows how much people are still obsessed with the Holy Land in England. One of the knights, Thomas Mowbray, when he's banished, says, "I'll go off to the Holy Land." And Henry IV, in his plays, keeps talking about wanting to lead a crusade. And at the very, spoiler alert, at the very end of the second part, he reveals there'd been a prophecy he was going to die in Jerusalem. And he's dying, and he says, "What room of the palace is this?" They say, "Oh, this is the Jerusalem room." And he says, "Oh, man, did I have that one wrong?" And Shakespeare sees something serious in that. I always found this very kind of abstract point. A couple of years ago, I was in Bodrum, Turkey, formerly Halicarnassus, and there's a giant Crusader castle there. I think the largest one left, Order of St. John's. When you get up to the top, there are these towers, the English Tower, the French Tower, and there's a tower built in Bodrum, Turkey, and it has the Lancaster coat of arms on it. And Henry IV had that tower built because he still wanted to contribute to recapturing the Holy Land. This would be the late 1300s. Shakespeare's aware of that, that this is a problem, that's an unrealistic goal to reconquer the Holy Land at that point. And that's one thing that Henry IV's son, Henry V, learns. Let's conquer France instead of the Holy Land. It's just across the English Channel. There's a lot of money there. Let's go win back France. Because, of course, his line is ultimately from the Anglo-Normans, so French. And that's the kind of shift in politics I think Shakespeare thought was needed. It shouldn't sound so strange to us. The idea was to take religion out of politics. Now, eventually, this became our principle of separation of church and state. England with a national church never quite got there. But still, what you can see in Shakespeare is the idea that politics is divisive enough without introducing a religious component into it. So that, for example, in Henry V, what Shakespeare shows about what in many respects I think is his ideal picture of a monarch, is that Henry V makes sure that he's got the church in line. Henry V opens, bizarrely for us, with a scene between the Archbishop of Canterbury and I believe the Bishop of Ely, and they're discussing a bill in Parliament to seize the church lands. And they've made a deal with Henry that if he leaves them their lands, they will support his claim to the throne of France. Being great interpreters of texts, they will read the French Salic law, which governs their inheritance, so that it means not what the French think it means, but what the English think it means. And so the church has made a deal to give Henry what it wants, and he'll let them maintain their lands. This, by the way, is a forerunner of what Henry VIII was to do when he established the Church of England and did seize all the lands of the Catholic Church. And again, I think this is an attempt to create united sovereignty. The other thing is that Shakespeare shows Henry V uniting the nobles behind him by getting them to join him in a crusade, but not for the Holy Land, but for France. And he assures them there are plenty of rewards coming. You'll all be richer and ennobled if we win our conquest in France. And Shakespeare, I think, has a real sense that this is how a monarch has to run things. The other remarkable thing he shows about Henry V is that he's in touch with his people, that he rallies the people to his side. And by the way, not just the English people, but quite self-consciously in the play, he is rallying the Welsh and the Irish and the Scottish to the British cause. Very, very important movement for an English monarch, as we can see even today, when they've got to worry about Scottish independence. And Shakespeare, in Henry IV, Part 1, shows the education of this prince, Prince Hal, who will go on to become Henry V. And it's presented as puzzling to everybody. He's not hanging around court. He's hanging around the taverns of Eastcheap. He's hanging out with criminals. He's drinking a lot. And everybody's puzzled by it. But what the prince is doing is learning his people. He knows he's going to have to lead them someday. And he says at one point, I could drink with any tinker in the land in his own language. Shakespeare shows he's learned their language. They call drinking deep dying scarlet. It's really important that he can talk to his people, and it seems trivial at the time. And yet when it comes to a crisis in the Battle of Agincourt, when the British are outnumbered 10-1 by the French, he's able to go about among his troops, his common people troops, and talk to them. And rally them to his side. And now, it's interesting. I mean, Shakespeare doesn't show this in the spirit of modern democracy. In fact, Prince Hal has a real aristocratic contempt for the common people. There's one point where he says more or less, I'm paraphrasing and I'm not as good as Shakespeare, I can't believe I'm hanging out with these lowlives. And he says to one of them, you know, you got two shirts, one for today, the weekdays, and one for Sunday. And yet, despite that, and in a way Shakespeare sees this as a great achievement, that despite his aristocratic contempt, Henry V, the future Henry V, does not make the mistake that the other English kings have done. And show his contempt for the common people, but rather he knows their importance and has learned to speak their language. And what I see here is that Shakespeare was hoping to modify English kingship, pointed in a new direction, which he hoped had a basis in the English spirit. He wanted to moderate English kingship. He was worried about the absolutist claims of the medieval monarchs, and so was hoping to create what's called a mixed regime in England, where yes, the king would be the ruler, but he would make sure that the barons, the great nobles, felt they were on board and were getting their share, but also that the common people would too. And you know, this is reflected in what emerged as the British Constitution with the House of Lords and the House of Commons and so on. Now, that's some idea of Shakespeare's sense of English history. And it's not static. He sees kingship changing over time. And he understands the trade-offs, and the medieval monarchy seems spiritual, and it claims such a nobility, and yet in many ways it was corrupt, and in any case it was unstable, and Shakespeare wants to move to something we would call more modern, and really starts to see in some ways project back into the reign of Henry V, what was to emerge as the strategy of the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII, Henry VIII, and good Queen Bess. Now there's some interesting touches though in Henry V here. There's a comic Welshman named Llewellyn, and he's always referring to how the Romans conducted their wars. And he's a bit of a pedant. And he keeps insisting that the Romans would have done this and the Romans would have done that, as if the Romans are his great example. And then in a chorus that begins Act 5, Henry's return to London after the triumphant Battle of Agincourt, which was on my birthday, by the way, the chorus compares him to a Roman general returning in triumph from a great victory. That's a very interesting moment that shows that Shakespeare looked back to Rome as a model and thought it could suggest ways in which England might improve its regime. And so let me move now to the Roman plays and what Shakespeare does there. Now, without openly calling for England to become a republic. I think he felt that there were ways in which the British monarchy could be reformed in republican directions, so that, for example, in the 18th century, the great French political theorist Montesquieu called England a republic masquerading as a monarchy, which in a way is how you could describe it today, as the descendant of that long process. So, why was Shakespeare interested in Rome, if he was so restricted in his horizons to Englishness? Well, Rome looked incredibly powerful to him. Its achievement, its political achievement, seemed unparalleled. Now, Rome was a fascinating subject. To this day, we are fascinated by it. I think if you look at the History Channel, Rome would rank 4th as the most interesting subject after Hitler, swamp people, and ancient aliens. I'm fascinated with Rome. I just love it. I've been there twice, and I've studied Roman ruins all over Europe. And so Rome is pretty impressive to us today. But just imagine how impressive it was before the days of nuclear weapons. Just how impressive something like the Colosseum looked during Shakespeare's lifetime. Not that he saw the Colosseum, but he probably heard of it. And of course, there were great Roman ruins in Britain, like Hadrian's Wall. And everywhere you looked in Shakespeare's day, you saw reminders of Roman greatness. You could see it even in the English language. The multitudinous seas incarnadine. It's a line from Macbeth. Shakespeare knew how important Latin was to the English language, and so on. And so, like so many of his contemporaries, and here Machiavelli would be a great example in his discourses on Livy, people looked to Rome as the greatest political achievement hitherto in the world, and they understood that Rome had conquered the entire Mediterranean world and much of Europe. And how did it do it? And I think Shakespeare was interested in that. And he really did imagine himself into an utterly alien world and see how deeply different Rome was. And for that, he wrote a play called Coriolanus, one of his 3 great Roman plays, Julius Caesar, Antony, Cleopatra, and Coriolanus. Now, Julius Caesar and Antony, Cleopatra are wonderful plays. They deal with great subjects. We would know of Julius Caesar or Antony Cleopatra if Shakespeare had never written plays about them. I don't think many of us would know about Coriolanus if Shakespeare hadn't written a play about him. And I think in some ways it's a more remarkable achievement, because there Shakespeare is thinking himself back into the earliest days of the Roman Republic, essentially when it formed in reaction to the expulsion of the Etruscan Tarquin kings in Rome. And it gave Shakespeare a chance to examine an utterly alien community, one which was completely pagan, completely civic, and completely devoted to war. Now, I'm not saying that Shakespeare was a warmonger, and indeed I'll suggest he shows great limitations to the world of Coriolanus, but it is a kind of experiment for him. What would a community have to be like to be so totally organized about war, around war, that it could beat any kid on the block, that it would defeat every army it ever faced, and if they lost a battle here and there to a Carthaginian, they'd eventually raze Carthage to the ground and sow the fields with salt, and so much for Carthage. And again, that's in many ways a limited human achievement, but it's in some ways a pretty impressive one. And Shakespeare portrays this early Roman Republic in all its alien character. For example, it has a purely civic religion. It is the gods of Rome are the gods of the city. They are these Roman gods. They are not universal gods as we find in the great trans-political religions of the world today. And that gives a kind of focus to things and a focus on political life. Shakespeare shows there's no belief in immortality, at least personal immortality, in the early Roman Republic. As a result, if someone wants to make himself immortal, he's going to have to win battles and win them big. And that's how you become immortal in Rome. And that puts a premium on great warriors, as he portrays in this character, Coriolanus, who can almost defeat a foreign city single-handedly. Moreover, it's a very small city, and everybody knows everybody else. And the entire weight of the community is brought to bear, as we see in the play, on young boys to raise them into warriors. One of the consuls in Rome, one of the great leaders, says at one point, it is held that valor is the chiefest virtue. You know, I asked myself, could an American politician get up today, except maybe at a military funeral, and say it is held that valor is the chiefest virtue? There'd be a firestorm. What about compassion? What about diversity? Valor is the chiefest virtue? Come on. But Shakespeare wants to look at a community where valor is held to be the chiefest virtue. You know it's not a Christian community where charity, forgiveness would be held as the chiefest virtue. And again, I'm not saying Shakespeare is advocating this, but part of his effort to study humanity is to study it in all its various forms. And for that, you have to look at different communities, because different communities emphasize different virtues and bring out different aspects. And what Shakespeare, you read that play or see that play, and you can understand why Rome produced one great conquering general after another. And again, the smallness of the city, the civic nature of the religion, the focus on valor, and the fact that the whole community was oriented towards politics and in a way to encourage participation in it. Rome never had a single ruler in the history of the Republic. It always had two consuls. And that meant that, and they served only 1 year. So it meant that there was a lot of turnover, and it was much easier for a young Roman kid to dream of being consul than it is, say, for an American to dream of being president, because there's only one president at a time, and it changes every 4 or 8 years. This Roman constitution gave the nobles a chance to serve in the Senate and participate in politics that way, and then the consul was the great leader, chiefly the leader of the armies. The consuls were the great generals, and there was a lot of opportunity to become consul. You couldn't succeed yourself. So every year you had 2 new consuls. And also Shakespeare shows, again, the consul was largely a goal for the nobles, though not entirely in the history of the Republic. But the common people in the Roman Republic had this institution of the tribunate. They would choose their tribunes, who were their representatives. That survives in, we name newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, the idea that the newspaper represents the people. And so even the common people have a say in the regime, because the tribunes had a veto power over everything that the Senate could do. And so Shakespeare shows, again, this was called a mixed regime in antiquity. Aristotle discusses it, and a Greek historian named Polybius applies it to Rome. And the idea was there was a kingly element, an aristocratic element, and a popular element in this Roman regime. And there I think Shakespeare saw the formula which he tried to work out in Henry V, that again, without trying to have an open republic, you might have a monarchy which acknowledged the aristocratic element and the popular element in the regime, as the Roman Republic had done initially. Now, Shakespeare doesn't offer the Roman Republic as perfect. It's a rather limited world. The goals of these people are rather limited. Of all Shakespeare's plays, Coriolanus is the least erotic. There's almost no sign of love between man and woman. Coriolanus addresses his wife, "My gracious silence, hail." So women's voice is very much subject in the world of the Republic, and Shakespeare understands that. And again, he's not offering this as a universal ideal. It's a kind of hypothetical imperative, one might say. If you want a warlike community that will conquer the world, this is a pretty good way to shape one. But you might not want to do that, and understand there's a trade-off here, that you're going to pay a price for that exclusive focus on politics. And indeed, what Shakespeare shows in his Roman plays is that over time, the Republic decays. I won't go into the details. You can read my book if you're interested in seeing it spelled out. But basically, the Roman Republic is corrupted by its own success. As it conquers more and more territories, it encounters foreign ways of life that are very alien, and which work to subvert that principle that valor is the chiefest virtue. For example, the Romans encounter the Greeks. And one thing Shakespeare shows in Julius Caesar is a Hellenization of the Roman Republic. That famous throwaway line of Casca, "It was Greek to me," when he hears Cicero speaking, but it was in Greek, and Casca claims not to understand it. It seems a trivial detail, but actually we find that, yeah, there's a lot of Romans speaking Greek in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and that it particularly means Greek philosophy. There's a Stoic in the play, Brutus. There's an Epicurean in the play, Cassius. Cicero is in the play, and he variously is thought of as a Platonist or an academic skeptic. There's a cynic who interrupts Brutus and Cassius in their argument. And we suddenly see, yeah, there's this Rome is infected with Greek philosophy. And indeed, there were many Romans, like Cato the Elder, who said it's going to be the end of the Republic if we start listening to these Greeks, these weak and corrupt Greeks. Now, there is, in some sense, it's a great thing for Rome that it's now exposed to Greek philosophy. There's no philosophers in the world of Coriolanus. On the other hand, it turns out that these philosophies tend to be apolitical or anti-political, and they do work to undermine the regime. Something similar happens in Antony and Cleopatra, that from having this very narrow civil religion, Rome starts to be exposed to foreign mystery religions. They start worshiping Isis in Rome. I haven't time to go into it, but I believe this is a kind of code word for Shakespeare to Rome's exposure to Christianity, another mystery religion out of the East. But in any case, you see the Roman virtues being undermined by being exposed to foreign influences. And above all, once Julius Caesar comes along and establishes one-man rule in the city, and then Octavius eventually becomes Augustus Caesar and establishes the empire, all that political participation of Romans in civic life and political life disappears. No more two consuls changing every year. There's one emperor for life. Now that meant they killed a lot of the emperors, and there's the famous year of 4 emperors and so on, but it does mean that political participation is tapped down under the empire, and it needs to be, because the last thing the emperor wants is someone challenging his rule and being ambitious. And the Roman Empire encourages vice, self-indulgence. Julius Caesar's famous line, "Antonius, let me have men about me that are fat." I've always liked that line. But the notion is, I don't, that Cassius has a lean and hungry look. Caesar doesn't like the old-style ambitious Romans. He wants someone like Mark Antony who parties all the time. And so here's an interesting example again. Change the regime, change the way of life. The Rome of Antony and Cleopatra is diametrically the opposite of the Rome of Coriolanus. And I think that Shakespeare relates that to the change from republic to empire. And again, he actually sees how with the emergence of the Roman Empire, it dissolved all the ancient cities and created life, political life, on an unprecedented and gigantic scale, and that changed everything. And again, all of the point at issue in Shakespeare is not what he advocated in political terms. It's what he understood about human life by understanding how changes in politics change the very terms of human life. And again, either close down certain possibilities as they open up new possibilities. And again, to me, the most remarkable achievement in a way in all of this is to have imagined a community in Coriolanus that is the polar opposite of the way politics worked in Shakespeare's day. Now, let me quickly turn to the modern Republic. Again, one of the most remarkable things in Shakespeare, because it shows him anticipating so many developments that were just beginning in his day. And here he was fascinated by Venice. Again, wrote 2 plays about Venice, shows a great understanding about Venice, talks about the city as if he'd been there. There are these theories. There's this lost period in Shakespeare's life where we have no record of where he was. It's actually surprising how often we really do know where he was, because he was involved in so many lawsuits that in his depositions he has to give his address. But there's a period early in his life where some people think he went to Italy. This is, he knows where the Rialto is in Venice. Now, I don't think he had to go there. I first learned about Venice by going to Las Vegas and seeing the Venetian. And I felt that was fine for a while. It's a lot cleaner, for example. But undoubtedly, Venetian merchants came to London. And one of the most popular things to do was to go to Shakespeare's theater, because it was known as the best theater in Europe. He probably met some Venetian merchants and draw me a little map. I'm thinking of writing a play. Draw me a little map of Venice here. And more to the point, he understands what makes Venice distinct. And that is, it's something new. It's a commercial republic. It is a community which brings people together for the sake of commerce. It is a city of merchants who are trading all around the world. And that means the city has to be cosmopolitan in a way that even Shakespeare's England was not, and certainly the ancient Roman Republic was not. That is, if you're trading with people around the world, you have to be open to them and to their different ways of life. So that just on the surface of it, what Shakespeare shows in Merchant of Venice is there are Jews in Venice. And they're there for the sake of commerce. They're not liked. Their religion is not respected, but it is tolerated. And you may not know this, but Jews were outlawed in England during Shakespeare's lifetime. Now, there are estimates that there may have been as many as 10,000 Jews in London masquerading as Christians, but in any case, on the law books, I guess it's Edward the Confessor had outlawed Jews in England. And of course, the Jews were kicked out of Spain in that curious year, 1492. And here was Venice admitting Jews. And in Othello, Shakespeare introduces the issue of Muslims. And Othello is the Moor of Venice. Now, he is a Christian. He is a converted Christian. But to the Venetians, he's a Moor. That's how they refer to him again and again. And that means whatever he may say, they think he's Muslim. And for example, a Venetian gentleman is not happy having this Moor marry his daughter. If he didn't have prejudices against Muslims, he wouldn't be so upset with this. So Shakespeare's showing something remarkable about Venice and this new kind of republic, that people, a community could tolerate differences. It sounds very modern to us. And it should sound modern to us, and it's very interesting how Shakespeare can think ahead to this. And it's very important in Venice that what it will do for the sake of commerce. When Shylock is trying to get his bond with Antonio enforced, the Duke of Venice says, we gotta stick to the law, because our whole reputation depends on it. People will not trade with us if we don't stick to our laws. And Shakespeare understands the connection between rule of law and republics and what commerce requires. And there's a lot of things admirable about the Venice he portrays, just as there were historically about Venice. It was not always a decaying tourist trap. It was once the greatest power in the Mediterranean. At its height, the Venetians controlled the entire Adriatic coast, including the city that's now Dubrovnik and was then called Ragusa. It controlled the majority of what's now Greece. It controlled the island of Crete, the island of Cyprus, the island of Rhodes. It was an incredibly powerful force, and it had the largest navy in the world. And eventually was key to standing up to Suleiman the Magnificent's navy for control of the Mediterranean. So it was it was the most advanced city industrially in Europe. Its arsenale that produced its warships was a model almost for what we now call mass production. They were turning out hundreds of ships a year. Anyway, it doesn't look so impressive now, but it was very impressive then, and Shakespeare was impressed by it. But, as always, he sees the defects and the virtues of everything. And in a way, there's no virtues without defects. It's why he was such a fundamentally tragic writer. And the problem is that Venice sacrifices a lot for the commercial spirit to prevail. And here there's a wonderful moment which I believe I'm the first person to notice. In the beginning of Merchant of Venice, this merchant Antonio is very sad. And his friends can't figure out why, and they think, oh, maybe he's in love, and he says no. And one of the merchants says, well, he's worried about his cargo. He's got all these ships out, and he's nervous about that. And he says, after all, when I sit in church and hear the sermon, I'm always thinking about my ships and how they may be sinking. And that's that tells you everything about Venice. This is the typical Venetian. He's sitting in church thinking of his merchandise and checking his insurance. It's just a throwaway line, but I finally realized that's what Shakespeare is telling us about this community, that it places commercial interests above religious interests. And in fact, the two people that don't fit into Venice are the Jew and the Christian. Not just the Jew, but also Antonio, the sincere Christian. He won't just let commerce prevail in his life. And Shylock at one point describes the strangeness of the community when he says to Antonio, and again I'm paraphrasing, I will buy with you, sell with you, deal with you, but I will not eat with you, drink with you, or pray with you. Now, we can understand that today. That's really the principle of the United States. I mean, we have to learn how to deal with people who are of different religions. But that was a very new idea, just beginning then. Because the idea that you could have a community of people who don't pray together, that was very strange to people well into Shakespeare's day. And Shakespeare's looking at this new possibility of the commercial republic, and he shows the problem with it, that this community is, because it's commercial, has special needs of foreigners. For example, it's a commercial community, largely of Christians, but they can't take interest from each other. It's prohibited in Deuteronomy. And so that's why they need Jews, because you can't be merchants without a money market. And so Venice admits Jews to perform an act it regards as irreligious, namely taking interest. Look at Othello. Venice is largely a community of merchants. They're not warlike. They're not brave and courageous, yet they face the Turks, a very warlike people. So Venice decides, we'll get our own Turk. We'll get this guy Othello, who's fought the Turks. Claims he's a Christian now, but really he fights well against the Turks because deep down he is a Turk. And you see the problem in Venice, that it admits people to the community for services it absolutely needs. Commercial republic's going to need money markets. Commercial republic is going to need to defend itself, in this case against the Ottoman Turks. But it's, in itself, it's not a warlike community. It's against taking of interest. Antonio is vehemently against the taking of interest. And so that's where we get the situation of what we would call second-class citizens in Venice. That when push comes to shove, it does not accept these foreigners. Shylock, at the trial in Act 4, suddenly finds himself prosecuted by a law that applies to aliens. And he thought he was a citizen of Venice. And similarly with Othello, as I mentioned, how much of a citizen is he if it's thought of as dubious that he marries a Venetian woman? Now I could go on and on about this, but I do want to say that, again, it's remarkable how Shakespeare was able to think his way in to the nature of a commercial republic when they were just appearing on the horizon in Florence and in Genoa and in Venice and soon to be in the Netherlands. And he sensed, I don't know if you'd say this is the wave of the future, but he sensed this was a new possibility. But once again, it was going to change the human condition so that it would reduce the importance of religion in human life in the name of commerce, and would set free all sorts of commercial energies. As Venice was the richest community in Europe at the time and still dominated the trade routes in Shakespeare's day, even despite Columbus and Vasco da Gama. But he saw that there were going to be problems with this Venetian community as well. So he writes a tragedy about Venice and Othello, and Merchant of Venice pushes a play as far as you can to tragedy, when you can still rescue comedy by an extremely forced fifth act, which really never convinces anybody as a resolution. So we've had a brief romp through history and geography with Shakespeare. Again, I've spent my whole life trying to figure this stuff out, but I thought it was worth trying to compress it into one ridiculously brief lecture to give a sense, again, of his range, and especially his ability to imagine himself out of his own circumstances as a 16th century Englishman, and imagine what a 5th century BC Roman was like, or a contemporary Venetian. I think ultimately this is what makes him the greatest of all authors, and that has given him the timeless character he has, that he was not restricted to his own age, but his imagination ranged freely through history and geography. Okay, I'll stop here. Yes?
Well, you talked about Shakespeare's the influence of Western civilization in Shakespeare, ranging among, including your interest in popular culture. Who might you suggest is most influenced effectively by Shakespeare in the realm of art?
Well, again, for example, Deadwood. There's a very great Shakespearean aspect to that show. And in fact, in the third season, David Milch introduces a Shakespearean actor. And there's a sequence where Milch splices in dialogue from Henry IV, Part 2, between Silence and Shallow, into the dialogue of the show. No indication I'm quoting for Shakespeare, but he shows that his dialogue is as good as Shakespeare's, because you can't pick out the Shakespeare lines from there. No one's noticed this, that I've seen, but is a remarkable achievement. And Milch was a professor at Yale. Thanks to his cocaine habit and his compulsive gambling, he had to go to Hollywood and write these shows to finance his bad habits. But as a result, we have Deadwood, which is, I think, one of the 5 greatest shows of all time. And I've just completed an essay called The Macbeth of Meth, the tragedy of Walter White, in which I use Macbeth to understand Breaking Bad. And I take another hour to explain that. But I think Vince Gilligan and David Milch are 2 examples of people, in Milch's case, is directly influenced by Shakespeare. Milch worked with Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren at Yale, a very literary figure. Gilligan is from Farmville, Virginia, so maybe not so literary, but I think in his case, he worked his way, and in fact, I've been using Macbeth because I think Walter White is a tragic hero, and people are hung up on the idea that he's a villain, and he does villainous things, but so does Macbeth. Macbeth kills little children just the way Walter White does, and I'm not advocating the killing of little children, but I think it is true that you can still be a hero and get caught up in a sequence of events that leads you to do terrible things. And I find it interesting that the concept of tragic hero is absent from the vocabulary of people who write about popular culture, and for good reason. There were no tragic heroes in I Love Lucy. And for a long time, television was unsophisticated. But in the past 10 years, I've seen people have talked about the emergence of the anti-hero, but I think in many cases it's the tragic hero. I first noticed this actually writing about John Ford's The Searchers, where Ethan does terrible things, but he's basically a heroic figure, and you want him on your side if you're in trouble. And what I noticed there's a kind of simplicity to the criticism of popular culture, which is usually appropriate to the simplicity of the works of popular culture. But now that we are getting these incredibly sophisticated works emerging, we have to turn to people like Shakespeare to help understand it. I'm trying to think what else would be Shakespearean in nature. Again, I'll stick with Breaking Bad and Deadwood.
So, interestingly, Deadwood was originally he wanted to set that on the Roman frontier, but another show was in production, so he moved it to U.S. territories. Would you suggest that maybe what we're seeing in the different kinds of formats of television and the different genres that are coming out, would you suggest there's something similar to what was going on in stage and the development of even of opera, different forms of entertainment going on in Shakespeare's time?
Yes, the fact is that most of the things, not all, but most of the things we think of as high culture today were popular culture in their day. And all these fancy schmancy things like Italian opera and Shakespeare's plays, they were just the popular culture of their day. And there's a kind of optical illusion that we now look at only the best of the works from the past and isolate them and think, Shakespeare's plays are so great, and they are. But you should look at all the plays we have. There's a play called A Christian Turned Turk by a man named Robert Dayborn. It's the single worst Elizabethan play I've ever read, and it's as bad as the worst thing you've ever seen on television. And it's obscene on top of all of that. And is there anyone in this room who's read A Christian Turned Turk? The big scene in the play is a circumcision. And the audience must have went wild seeing that staged. I'd like to see the stage directions for that one. But so yeah, I think we have an illusion that popular culture is somehow uniquely debased now, but it's always been debased. I recently discovered what's called Sturgeon's Law. Theodore Sturgeon was my favorite science fiction writer when I was a kid, and I discovered he formulated the most important law of culture. 90% of everything is crap. I think he underestimates it. It's more like 95%. And so there's a lot of crap on television now. There's a lot of crap in Shakespeare's day. It's estimated that 40,000 novels were written in England in the 19th century. Who reads even 100 of them anymore? So I think what we have to understand about culture is that at every time there's all this stuff going on, and most of it is lousy, but it is what you need. In fact, what I'd say is what you most need for culture is a broad base and access to cultural production, so that it was great in Shakespeare's day that there were several theater companies in England, and there were rival theater companies going after playwrights. And it's clear that playwrights thought, young men thought, wow, if I'm ambitious, go to London. That's where the money is. That's where the fame is. And they had many opportunities. And it's the same, let's say, with the Victorian novel or Italian opera. And, you know, for me, the big moment in television was the breakdown of the triopoly of the big networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. The younger people in the audience can barely imagine the era of 3-channel TV. But at that point, as the great producer of Gilligan's Island, Sherwood Schwartz, pointed out, there were 3 people in the world who controlled access to television, the program directors at ABC, NBC, and CBS. Rupert Murdoch broke that with Fox, and so much of the most original programming came on Fox, including The Simpsons and The X-Files. And now with cable, and now with streaming, it's the greatest moment in history to be a TV writer. And TV, I think the most sophisticated narrative writing in the world today is being done for TV, because so many big rewards, so many opportunities, and you can get started very easily now. And if you look at the great eras of culture, almost all of them before university-based modernism, you will find that the great achievements in culture rested on some kind of broad base, often commercial in nature. And it's like evolution. Nature is prodigal. Nature does not sit around producing the single perfect animal. It just tries all these species and sees which ones last. And at the end, it looks like, oh, this was perfectly designed, so on, but we know it was a process of evolution. And I think culture is similar in that way. That's what my next book's going to be about. Yes.
You portrayed a side of Shakespeare that I think defies the popular image of him as an entertainer. You presented him as a scholar.
Not a scholar, as a philosopher. Please. There's a distinction.
So my question is, do you feel like he had a mission in what he was doing in his plays? Did he solely want to entertain? Was hand to mouth was just a living for him? Admittedly, a great living, and he got to experience it.
I don't see why these things are incompatible, why people... Shakespeare was a very ambitious man, and I believe socially ambitious. He wanted a coat of arms. He wanted to be a gentleman. I think his childhood was humiliating when his father got thrown out as essentially mayor of Stratford, and I think, you know, he did everything to make money. He became a millionaire in modern terms, bought land and more land because he wanted to be a gentleman, eventually got that coat of arms. But that's entirely compatible with his being a great thinker. And he had a very rare talent to be a profound thinker and also to entertain people. Though it's not, it's not unprecedented, and there are, you know, novelists like Dostoevsky or Thomas Mann have philosophical depth and yet were popular, wrote bestsellers, and so on. Walter Kaufman said of Shakespeare, he was able to give the odor of sty to his pearls before casting them before the swine. And it is astounding, you know, how popular he was in his own day and has continued to be. As somebody, you know, he's such a magnificent poet and such a great dramatist. But I do think there's this deeper level. I mean, that's what I was stressing tonight, and to me, it's the thing that has most enchanted me about Shakespeare. And I will, you know, I think ultimately his goal was philosophical in the sense that it was understanding. He wanted to understand human nature. And indeed, you can say that because of how profoundly he grasped human nature, he can write plays that appeal to human nature. I actually think that he may have had a sort of political program. I do not think that Shakespeare shaped the modern British regime, but I wouldn't underestimate his role in shaping it. That generations upon generations of not so bright British aristocrats saw these plays, learned them by heart in some cases, and it had an effect. As I say, I think it was a kind of moderating effect of holding up an ideal of the British monarchy that was reshaped on the model of the Roman Republic. That makes it sound too programmatic, I realize, but you got to put it some way, and I'm trying to get across the idea. And Harold Bloom has famously claimed that Shakespeare invented the human. I'm more modest to say invented the Englishman. And you know, we're so tempted to look at his plays and, oh, it's just like the English. And you know, the verbal facility of the English is so extraordinary. You just have to watch boxing and listen to an American heavyweight champion interviewed compared to Anthony Joshua, a British heavyweight champion. It's just astounding, the inarticulateness of, say, a Mike Tyson. And don't tell him I said that. Because he still packs a punch or short, but these Lennox Lewis, for example, the British heavyweight champion. I mean, the guy was incredibly eloquent, talking after the matches, and you know, maybe that's genetic, but maybe it's that they've all grown up with Shakespeare in a way that is more intimate than we do. And now again, you want to say Shakespeare was English, and his verbal exuberance and fecundity probably comes from that, but he certainly had a great effect in reinforcing it and making these people the most verbal people on earth. And I do think he had an effect in British politics, and sometimes at the highest levels, like Winston Churchill. Yes?
Who would you put second to Shakespeare in the legacy department?
Not Vince Gilligan. Could I just... Oh, you mean in the whole of Western civilization? Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. That'll stop you. And he was, I mean, he makes Leonardo look like a one-track mind, because he was, anyway, you know, if I had to pick one person, it would be Goethe. And if this was an audience of Germans, you'd all be applauding now. Boy, there's a question over there.
Yes, you mentioned that some scholars thought that he went to Italy during the lost years.
Yeah.
I wondered if you had a special or favorite, theory about what he was doing during those years.
I actually don't. I do sense get out of Stratford was a big aim in his life. So what, there's all sorts of rumors, but I hate to dignify them. I was telling Steve this, though, earlier. I do think he was an incredibly ambitious man who knew how great he was, knew how smart he was, and knew how, here's a guy who, not a single day in his life was he not the smartest person in the room. And even if he met Francis Bacon, which I don't think he did, and here he was, one-horse hick town, Stratford, where his father embarrassed himself, and where he seems to have been forced to marry a certain woman because he got her pregnant and so on. And it looked like his life was over, I think, when that happened. And I think he just gritted his teeth and said, I'm getting out of here, and eventually got to London. I was just mentioning to Steve, he probably had a heavy Warwickshire accent. And there's, let me get this right, As You Like It, a character named Bill shows up, and he's an incredible country bumpkin. And I think that's how Shakespeare must have felt when he came to London, dazzled by the big city, saw all these university-educated men writing plays, and he'd only been to high school, though it was a very good high school, and he learned Latin better than kids in college do today, and so on. And it must have been humiliating to him, and people tried to humiliate him, called him an upstart crow, and the only Shake scene in the language. It's a big joke about him. And I think he fought it, and he stayed, and prevailed in the end. As I say, who knows? You have the sense he was wandering, was trying to figure out what to do. The one thing he didn't want to do was stay in Stratford. And thank God he didn't. Yes.
You mentioned early on in the paper that you felt that Shakespeare...
Paper? What paper? There's no paper here.
Presentation. That Shakespeare, you feel, found early and medieval kingship to be deeply problematic.
Yeah.
So, given the fact that the matter of Britain was so popular amongst the Tudors and then the succeeding Stuarts, would perhaps this feeling about feudal monarchy maybe be the reason why he avoided the whole topic of King Arthur and the matter of Britain?
Yeah, it's a very interesting issue, because some of you may not know that Henry VIII's brother, his older brother, was named Arthur, and the Tudor dynasty was hoping to establish itself by reviving interest in King Arthur. It was little Art that got married to Catherine of Aragon, leading later to the problems when Arthur died young, and we got Henry VIII instead. And you've got Spenser's Fairy Queen, an enormous effort to repackage the Arthurian legend for Elizabethan times. John Milton originally considered writing his epic on King Arthur, and then he decided it's untrue. These stories are legend. I'm not going to base the greatest epic ever written, which I'm going to write, on an untrue story. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Shakespeare he wrote King Lear, he wrote Cymbeline. He does go back to that material. But I think he was trying to write about what looked to him like historical England, and he worked with sources, and, Richard III wasn't as evil as he portrayed him, and that sort of thing. So he had an agenda. But when I started studying this stuff, reading about Shakespeare, it was all the Tudor myth, and that Shakespeare bought into it, and he was just supporting it. I don't think that's true for a moment. I think he was very skeptical about it, and he understands that there's a mythic element to kingship, and Henry V illustrates that. The guy creates a myth of Agincourt on the spot. Indeed, after winning it by the single most dubious action in all of Shakespeare, namely executing the French prisoners, suddenly Henry is saying, all credit to God. I had nothing to do with this victory. And that's an example of mythologizing. to shore up your rule. But I mean, as Shakespeare thinks, Richard II's problem was his rule was all poetry and no reality. Henry IV's problem is it's all reality and prose and no poetry. And the thing you can say about Henry V is he learns to put together the prose and poetry and base his regime on some very Machiavellian realistic principles, but give it the aura of some kind of sanctity. He knows that his task is to restore sanctity to the regime after his father committed the sacrilegious act of murdering the anointed king, even though that was necessary. One last question. Oh, yes?
What would Shakespeare be writing about in America today?
Well, that's interesting. I think he'd be writing for TV. I think he would have loved long-form narrative, and that's where the money is now and the fame, and so he'd be there. You know, it's hard to say. I've often said this. Looking at the 20th century in America, I think the two subjects Shakespeare would have been most interested in are George Patton and Douglas MacArthur. And I think Coppola's screenplay for Patton is one of the most Shakespearean things written in the 20th century. I mean, when you look at Shakespeare's heroes, they are flawed military heroes who achieve glorious things but screw up when it get involved with domestic politics. And so the obvious thing he would write about, I think, are it's arguable there's something tragic about MacArthur and Patton. The interesting thing is whether he would have made the jump to the modern hero, let's say the entrepreneur, whether he would have, but I'm suspicious of that. So, but the other thing I'll say is his mind and imagination were so much greater than mine that, if I could answer your question, I'd be writing the greatest play in the world today. People always say to me, well, what's the next great TV show? And my answer is, if I knew that, I wouldn't be wasting my time at the University of Virginia. I'd be out in Hollywood creating the show. And it is something we sometimes don't face the fact that the great authors like Shakespeare are simply in another league from us. I point this out to my students. If Shakespeare had died at age 20, we wouldn't know that we were missing King Lear and Hamlet. We couldn't imagine them. And so I will do such things, what they are I know not, but they shall be the terrors of the earth. That's King Lear. That's the way shall be the wonders of the earth. If Shakespeare were alive today, we couldn't begin to dream of what he'd be doing. So get out the DNA kit, clone the guy, and let's see what happens. But I will say, earlier he would have been doing movies. Now I'm pretty sure he'd be attracted to TV, because TV is a writer's medium in the way that movies are not, and certainly aren't now. Okay, that's a good way to end it. Thank you.